The world changed on a Tuesday. I remember the sky was a flat, boring gray. Then the news broke. A company called Avum had done it. They had broken time. They called it the Chronos Key. It was a sleek silver device that could open a door to any year, any day, any minute. The world held its breath. We saw the first traveler step out of a shimmering portal. He had been to see the dinosaurs. He brought back a fossil, still warm. Everyone cheered. We thought it was a new dawn for humanity, a gift for all of us. But we were wrong. It was never meant for all of us. It was a discovery, yes, but it was also a product. The price tag was announced a week later. It was a number with so many zeros, it looked like a joke. Only the richest people in the world could even dream of affording it. A single trip cost more than a small country's entire budget. Suddenly, time was not a river we all floated on together. It was a private lake, owned by the wealthy. They built exclusive resorts in the past. They created private timelines. The rest of us could only watch the advertisements. We saw them walking with historical figures. We saw them changing their own small mistakes. They could relive their best days over and over again. The promise of the Chronos Key was for everyone. The reality was a lock only they had the key for. The rules came next. They were called the temporal accords. The governments, funded by the same rich people, made them law. Rule 1. Do not significantly alter major historical events. That was for stability. Rule 2. All temporal travel must be registered and monitored by Avum. That was for safety. But the unwritten rule was the most important. Only those who could pay could play. The past became their exclusive playground. They could visit their ancestors, fix business deals that went wrong, or simply vacation in a time before pollution stained the sky. For the rest of us, history was just a book. For them, it was a brochure. This new world felt like a betrayal. The initial hope soured into a deep, bitter anger. We were stuck in the present, with all its problems. We watched our world get hotter, our resources grow scarcer. Meanwhile, the elite could just leave. They could visit a perfect, untouched beach in the 1920s. They could escape the consequences of the world they helped create. The advertisements showed smiling faces, perfect families on perfect temporal vacations. But on the streets, the faces were not smiling. They were hard. They were tired. They were watching the shiny doors to the past open and close, always for someone else. We were not just poor anymore. We were temporally disadvantaged. Life for the wealthy became a carefully edited film. They used the Chronos Key not for grand adventures, but for small, selfish corrections. A bad investment? They went back a week and pulled their money out. A social embarrassment? They went back and stayed home. Their lives became flawless, free of error or regret. They called it temporal optimization. They smoothed over every rough edge of their existence until it was perfect. They never had to learn from their mistakes because they could simply erase them. They grew stronger, richer, and more untouchable with every trip. Their children never failed a test. Their businesses never made a bad decision. Their power was absolute, but it was also quiet. They did not change the outcomes of wars or prevent assassinations. That was too messy, too noticeable. Instead, they made subtle changes. They bought land just before a valuable resource was discovered there. They invested in companies moments before a breakthrough. Their fortunes, already huge, grew into mountains of wealth that towered over the rest of society. The gap between the rich and the poor was no longer a gap. It was a canyon. It was a chasm. They lived in a golden bubble, protected by their ability to control their own personal history, making them seem infallible, almost like gods. The past was their ultimate luxury good. They hosted parties in Renaissance Florence. They took safaris to see woolly mammoths. They owned private moments in time the way they owned private islands. These temporal estates were guarded by Avum's security, ensuring no one else could access that specific moment. Imagine owning a perfect sunset from the year 1888. It was theirs, and theirs alone. They collected experiences, hoarding them away from the common person. The rest of us were left with blurry pictures in history books, while they had the real thing, a perfect, high-definition memory that they could visit anytime they wished. This power changed them. They started to see the rest of us as different. We were the people who had to live with consequences. We were the ones who had to accept loss and failure. They saw our struggles not as human, but as a weakness. They became detached from the world they technically lived in. Why worry about climate change in 2025 when you can spend your weekends in the pristine air of 1605? Why care about poverty when you can erase any financial mistake you ever made? They lost their empathy. They floated above the rest of humanity, looking down from a place of perfect, curated lives, forgetting what it was like to be grounded in the messy, unchangeable reality of a single timeline. For those of us left behind, life became a waiting game. We lived in the static present, as the rich called it. We were the ones who had to deal with the world as it was. Prices for everything went up. The wealthy, with their insider knowledge of the future, had already bought up all the valuable resources. Food became more expensive. Housing became impossible. We were living with the scraps they left behind. A feeling of hopelessness settled over our communities like a thick fog. What was the point of working hard when the game was already rigged? What was the point of dreaming when the future was already owned? Anger was a constant companion. We saw them on the news, stepping out of their temporal portals, smiling and waving. They looked rested. They looked happy. They had just spent a month in a world without our problems. We saw our own faces reflected in the screens, tired and worn down. The anger was a low fire, always burning. Sometimes it would flare up. Protests would break out in front of EVM headquarters. People would shout and hold signs that said, "Time for all," or "Our history, not yours." But the protests were always broken up. EVM had its own private security, armed with weapons that seemed to come from a slightly more advanced future. We started to notice small changes, ripples from their travels. A street name would be different. A brand we remembered would suddenly have never existed. These were the side effects of their temporal optimizations. They called them minor echoes. For them, it was a small price to pay for a perfect life. For us, it was a constant reminder that our reality was not stable. It was fragile. It could be changed at any moment, without our consent or knowledge. We lived in a world that felt like a draft, a story that someone else was constantly editing. It made us feel like ghosts in our own lives, powerless and unseen. The worst part was the loss of a shared reality. We used to have one history. We all learned about the same events, the same triumphs, the same tragedies. Now, we were not so sure. What parts of our history were real, and what parts were the result of some rich person's trip to the past? We started to distrust everything. We distrusted the news. We distrusted our history books. We even distrusted our own memories. Did that really happen? We would ask each other. The division was not just about money anymore. It was about reality itself. They had their edited, perfect past. We were left with a present that was fractured and uncertain. But people do not give up easily. Even in the face of impossible odds, they fight back. A resistance began to form in the shadows. They called themselves the Static. They were hackers, engineers, and historians who were locked out of the past. Their goal was simple: to break EVM's monopoly on time. They worked in secret, building their own less reliable time machine from stolen parts and black market tech. It was dangerous work. Getting caught meant disappearing, not just into a prison, but possibly from the timeline altogether. Yet they kept trying. They believed that time belonged to everyone, and they were willing to risk everything for that belief. The Static's first successes were small. They could not send people back, not yet, but they could send information. They started leaking the truth about the wealthy's temporal trips. They revealed the market manipulations, the historical adjustments made for profit. They showed the world how the elite were not just visiting the past, but plundering it. The Static also sent messages to us, messages of hope. They reminded us that history was not finished. They told us that the future was not yet written. Their actions were like small cracks in Evum's perfect facade. For the first time since the Chronos Key was revealed, we felt a spark of something other than despair. The conflict is escalating. Evum sees the static as terrorists who threaten temporal stability. They hunt them with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. The static sees themselves as freedom fighters, trying to reclaim a fundamental human right. It is a new kind of war, fought across time itself. It is not a war of armies and bombs, but of information and secrets. The wealthy fight to protect their perfect, edited lives. The static fights for a future, where everyone has a say in their own story, where no one is left behind in a static present. The rest of us are caught in the middle, hoping for a world where time is once again a river we all share. Looking forward to the future, I see two paths. One path leads to a greater divide. The wealthy retreat further into their private timelines, creating a permanent barrier between their world and ours. Society splits into two species, the temporal elites who live forever in their curated pasts, and the static masses, left to inherit a broken present. The other path is harder, but it holds a glimmer of hope. It is the path where the static succeeds, where time travel is either destroyed or made available to all. It is a path towards equality, where history becomes a shared lesson again, not a private commodity. The fight is far from over. Today is October 17th, 2025, and the future is still unwritten, for now.